Elizabeth King, and I'm the Global Director for Education at the World Bank. I'm based in Washington.
Can you briefly discuss what the World Bank does in the field of education?
Oh, the World Bank has been, next year we will be celebrating the 50th anniversary of the World Bank providing external aid to education in developing countries. The first grant was to, the first, it could be a bit a little, was to Tunisia, given in 1962 for developing its secondary education program. And over the past decade, in the first decade of the 2000, of the new millennium, we gave about $25 billion to education in developing countries. These are of course divided, more than half of that, about 60% or so, actually went to countries, some of the poorest countries in the world, and on either zero interest loans or outright grants. We work in about 140 countries, or possibly more. We fund, we invest in primary education, secondary and tertiary education, including universities. We also support teacher training. So, the works, so to speak.
So you are the biggest investor of education in the world, you'd say?
I guess the biggest external to the government. The biggest investor in education, Ponce, is still the governments of countries, and still the countries themselves. So.
But you hold the biggest fund externally, and you're the director, and so you fund the. I'm kidding.
Yeah, well, it means to say, yeah, it's sort of my job is really more of a I guess, as a professional leader or a technical leader. I'm not really doing the investments myself. So it's really the countries themselves.
Right. So what you do specifically is you identify the needs in terms of education and the right way to invest in them?
Right. The staff, the staff of the World Bank who work on education do this actually in collaboration with the countries, is really to identify where are the investments to be made, and investments are really, it means it's a generic word for putting the funding in, and there are returns, but the returns are mostly to the countries themselves, because it's really the countries who are investing in this, right? And we're just sort of externally funding. Most of these projects are identified with government and really come from the demand of governments. So if countries are not demanding, they have no project. So we rely very much on the demand of countries in terms of the size, in terms of the nature of the projects.
So our interest in this conference is on the behalf of students, and so I'll be asking a set of questions that I feel would be what the other students would like to hear on your end.
Okay.
We'd probably like to know since you said that it's mostly on the government side, would you feel that those demands and those that they ask for are of to the best interest of a learner-centered education, or would you say promoting a more student-focused agenda in general?
Yeah, well, now that's a loaded question to some extent, right? I would say that because we work in so many countries, it depends. Right? There are some countries where the governments are much more accountable to the population, to the citizens. And in those countries where governments are more accountable, we are more confident that what they're asking for, what they're demanding for funding, that those are more, I would say, consistent, more aligned with the interests of the countries themselves. But there are also many countries where the accountability to the citizens is rather weak. So we have our own, of course we have our own analysis of what a country might need given where they are in terms of their education outcomes, education indicators. And we feel that it is our duty to actually discuss those with government. We are also probably the biggest source of knowledge in education in the developing countries as a single organization. So we think that our operations are generally evidence-based, so that we can inform countries so we can sort of almost, I wouldn't say act as a check, but this is really a dialogue. So we can certainly influence the dialogue with countries. The question is whether in those countries where the accountability is not so strong, whether the funding is really spent where they're supposed to be spent is sometimes a question. We have our own guidelines for making sure that they are, but you have some of the countries, it might not be exactly additional to their resources, because as we put resources in, they might actually take the domestic resources out of there and put it somewhere else. So there are many reasons, right? So the effectiveness of the aid that we give depends a lot really on the political will, the capacity of the government to do what is good, what is the best for the countries.
Well, for much of the learners present here, it's our first time to think of the education context and issues in general as a world issue. And on your end, who constantly thinks about that on a daily basis, and us who are more local in this sense, how do you make sure, I guess, that what are the mechanisms of when you say investments? And you say you work a lot with government, right?
Yes.
And how do you...
The governments of the countries are our main
Yes. Your,
clients. We don't lend to the private sector.
Yes. Is there, you mentioned about those investment mechanisms and policies.
Yes.
Could you briefly explain to us how you try to make those governments accountable and what those...
I see. For the use of the funds that we make available to them. We have, since you're a business administration major, you understand this. So there are fiduciary mechanisms for doing
that. I don't understand. But
so there are procurement guidelines. Right. So we have established guidelines about how to use the funds. We have, for example, we want to make sure that who actually are implementing the programs or the projects. So when the government subcontracts to other entities, that procurement is competitive, that it's to the best interest of the countries.
What would you say are the main victories of the World Bank in terms of education?
Right. So just one more, because that's only one part of the story. The other part of the story in terms of actually making sure that the accountability is also to the countries that the funds are used not only properly and transparently, but also effectively, that they have impact. So one of the things we do, of course, is we make sure that there's supervision, but also that we monitor the impact of the use of the resources, of these aid funding. So what was your other question?
Let's scrap that.
Oh, okay, all right.
How do you monitor then that it goes down to the students or?
Well, right. It's very difficult. That's very costly to do. whether the incidence in economic language, it would be whether the benefit incidence is really ascertained, right? So whether the beneficiaries, the intended beneficiaries, actually benefited. One of the things we've done before is tracking the flow of resources through the system, a tracking survey. So you follow the money. So you see it come into the central government, then how much of, let's say for $100 of aid, what proportion of the $100 actually leave the central government, go to the, let's say the provincial government in the case of the Philippines, and then how much of that $100 goes to the, the districts and so forth and so on. I guess the division and the district. So, finish? Yeah. So let me just finish that one.
Yes.
So then you go all the way to the students, see whether in fact the books get there. So the proportion of the $100 that go there. There's another way by which we've been able to do that. Actually, it's the government that's been doing that, which is following the textbooks, and also whether the textbooks, for example, are actually reaching the students. But it's not just the World Bank, but certainly the government has been very concerned. The Philippine government actually, these are some of the things that it looks at, is whether in fact the resources that have been paid for actually get to the students.
That's great to hear, ma'am. Just to wrap up, what would you like to say to all students everywhere who could be watching us as the Director of Education for the World Bank?
Well, I think the voices of students. I think students are the most powerful advocate for good education. And make sure you don't put up with bad education, bad instruction. You make sure that you get the real learning that you deserve when you enter the classroom. Because nobody else is going to watch it. Nobody else can see.
So thank you very much, Dr. Kay. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you, and once in a lifetime experience, I think.
Thank you very much. Thank you.